at the age of between 5 and 10, I was being introduced to these characters via comics, specifically in 2000 AD, that allowed me to imagine animals to be something other than sausages, or something to look at in a zoo, or to laugh about on an ad. And all credit goes to Pat Mills and to people like Alan Moore for broadening my horizons, because there was nothing else going on in my life that could have told those stories.
Good evening, Mark. How are you?
Good evening, Jamie. I'm doing very well. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. Well, it's a pleasure to have you as a guest on Sentientism. We have a few sort of mutual connections, including, I know you've listed some of our previous episodes, people like Tom Harris, some of the themes of Corey Lee Wren's work linked with yours as well, which might be interesting to explore. And Phil McKibben too, a previous guest, author of Politics of Love. So it's great to get the chance to bring you onto the guest list too and have a chat. And you know this already, but I guess it's a series of conversations about the deepest philosophical questions, and I think the most important ones, given the power us humans have. And they're questions of epistemology, what's real, how should we best understand this strange universe we all share, but just as importantly, questions of ethics, what matters at the foundation, who gets to count in our ethical thinking. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize Sentientism as a really pluralistic, broad worldview that, when answering the what's real question, suggests we should take a broadly naturalistic approach, using evidence and reason as best we can with a healthy dose of humility to try and understand things. And on the ethics question, it's very open and pluralistic, but it does insist that every sentient being at least should get to count seriously in our moral consideration, any being that can feel, that can experience things. But I'm talking in these conversations to a broad range of people, some of whom agree with that philosophy and some don't. So it'll be interesting to understand your own sort of philosophical journey and how that runs through your work today. But before we get onto those questions, how would you best introduce yourself for people who haven't come across you and your work so far?
I'm a long-term vegan activist. I came from the Anarcho-punk milieu. I used to be a hardcore anarchist, less sort of hardcore about that now. Anarchish, I think, is best described. I recently wrote a book on the history, very rich history, of 2 centuries of direct action for animals in Ireland between 1822 and 2022. I also run a website. It's the same name as the book, which is The Humanity Trigger, which was the precursor to the book, the website first. And then I thought that if I write this properly, it's going to make a pretty good story, a really good narrative arc. It's got everything. So there was the website first, there's a book now, and I'm also on the board of the Vegan Society. So campaigning and acting on behalf of animals has been a lifelong passion and cause of mine, really, since I was very young. So in my previous life, I haven't worked for a number of years now, but I used to work in mental health. I did 20 years as a psychiatric nurse and as a learning disabilities nurse as well in Ireland and the UK and in New Zealand. I'm a stay-at-home dad now. I've got 2 wonderful kids who we're raising vegan on the edge of a rainforest, on the edge of Auckland, on the edge of the planet Earth. So yeah, in short, that's who I am and where I am right now.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Quite a life so far. So let's start with the first of those deep philosophical questions, that question about what's real. And it's such a broad question because it covers everything we might believe, but often a good way into the topic is to understand how people grew up originally. Was it in more of a religious or a supernatural context with their family and friends and culture, or one that was maybe more naturalistic or atheistically or agnostically minded, or something different, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time, if it has. So yeah, I don't know if you want to wind the clock back and tell us the story of that side of your thinking.
To answer your question succinctly as to what is real, things that still exist, irrespective of whether people believe in them or not, are what's real. I was raised in an Irish Catholic, staunchly Irish Catholic family and society when it was still dominated by the church, by the Catholic Church. So our sense of reality growing up was filtered through the eyes of a deeply authoritarian, I would say, fascist adjacent dictatorship of the Roman Catholic Church.
You'd put it in those extreme terms, yeah?
Yes, I would, yes. And the government were simply puppets at the beck and call of the church when the church chose to intervene. So it's interesting, there was the church that I used to go to was run by the Redemptorist priests, who are sort of a sect, like a monk-like sect of priests, but they aren't monks, they're priests in Cork City. And they're on the surface, they preach very worthy things, giving to the poor and working for the poor. And they take vows of chastity and poverty and obedience and stuff like this. And there's a certain a certain way with their sort of thinking. But they had a magazine that they had released every month. It was called Reality. And it was, as far as they were concerned, what they were talking about, this deeply Catholic, almost pre-1968 Vatican Catholic sort of thinking, very medieval thinking. They believed in resurrections and ascensions to heaven and virgin births and all that. But as far as they're concerned, that was all reality. And that was the name of their magazine. So reality when I was growing up was a very skewed, a very highly church dominated, entirely church, Catholic church filled sense of reality. So it was highly distorted.
I don't know if you remember, but what was your response to that stuff as a kid? Because in a way, terms like authoritarian are quite strong and might seem quite dissonant to some of my audience when they hear you use those terms to talk about a religion. But at the same time, the themes of unquestionable dogma and a totally centralized authority. I mean, how else would you describe it in a way? But what was your response as a kid to that stuff? Did you buy into it? Did you believe it?
I tried to believe it because it was what everyone around me was saying was true. And as a kid, you're intuitively going to believe whatever your parents are telling you, especially if they believe it too. And there isn't any sense that as far as they were concerned, they were not lying to me. So it came across as truthful because they believed it, and I just accepted this because everyone else around me did so. And anyone that even thought or even asked questions about it was deemed to be dangerously sort of on a slippery slope here. I know people might think I'm egging this up a bit. If you haven't been brought up in a strictly religious environment, it's very hard to imagine what it's like when everyone around you believes in the devil, and the devil's watching you, and so's God and Jesus, and then all these things are sins, and they are being seen by higher deities. There's a heaven and a hell. This was all true as far as the social consensus was.
Not just parables, not just stories, not just...
No, it was literal. The transubstantiation, when the priest raises the bit of communion bread above his head every week at church, and then the bell rings, Jesus does come down into that bread. His body is in that bread. You eat that bread. You are cannibalized. It is literal. It is not meant to be taken as a metaphor. That's the split between Catholicism and Protestantism, right?
Yeah, it really is the blood and flesh of Christ. Yeah.
That is it, yeah. So I tried to believe it, but I couldn't. And I was being exposed to, despite the censorship of society, sort of implicit and formal and informal, things like comics used to slip beneath the radar of my parents and of society generally. So I got really into 2000 AD, and specifically there's a guy called Pat Mills who used to manage that comic actually, and wrote tons of the scripts, and loads of those scripts I read into those scripts stuff like Flesh, Strontium Dogs, some of Judge Dredd. Non-human animals had agency, were lead actors in these scripts, were the heroes and villains, are humans for this world to work. They wore clothes, they drove vehicles, they had money, they had guns, they had weapons, they had agendas, and they were non-human animals. And I think that's where my exposure to that idea, outside of the dominion idea, which is so prevalent in Orthodox Catholicism, it was a direct slap in the face of the idea of dominion, where animals are simply either furniture in the background or something to be eaten, and there's nothing in between. So it introduced me to, at the age of between 5 and 10, I was being introduced to these characters via comics specifically in 2000 AD that allowed me to imagine animals to be something other than sausages, or something to look at in a zoo, or to laugh about on an ad for PG tips or something, It was intuitive. I don't know exactly where it come from, but I'm sure the comics must have helped that along, or maybe we were the direct inspiration for that. And all credit goes to Pat Mills and to people like Alan Moore for broadening my horizons, because there was nothing else going on in my life that could have told those stories. It was an arch conservative society.
So what was your journey on the religion front? So you found this sort of subversive connection with some other perspectives that you could cling on to in some way. But
Yeah, I would try and read the Bible, and the language was so archaic. And I mean, this is at the age of 9 and 10, and I was thinking, right, if this is the book everyone's saying is the book, the Bible, the only one to read, I would try and read it. So I started from the start, and I just disliked it straight away. I mean, it's Genesis, and it's got on about dominion and having dominion over everything that flies and crawls and swims and all the rest of it. It's basically like a mind camp for the human supremacist outlook, I think, something like Genesis and Leviticus. So I couldn't get into religion at all. I couldn't understand why it was so pervasive and deep in the society I was being brought up in. My parents were really into it. My dad actually was going to become a priest before he got a job in the bank and met my mom and all the rest of it. He used to sort of read parables from the Bible to us at meal times, most evenings. He used to go to church every single day, and he still does. He's still alive. He does the accounts for the local parish. He's on first name terms with the local priest, deeply involved in the church, despite it all. So I just couldn't get into it. I was exposed to Anarcho-punk when I was about 14 or 15. That pinned me to the wall, bands like Crass and Conflict and so on. And that really sort of focused, I think, while it started with my comic era some years before, it really focused this and politicized it and gave it names and gave you agendas and ideas and presented a very black and white, stark version of the world, and highly aggressive at times and really out of the ordinary for me. I had heard nothing. I don't have an older brother. I wasn't exposed to. I hadn't even heard of the genre. I'd heard of punk. I hadn't even heard of the Sex Pistols at that time. Hadn't heard them. I'd heard of them, and had never heard of Anarcho-punk. Certainly, I had never heard of Crass. This was all completely new to me. I was into heavy metal. I was into Iron Maiden and Black Sabbath and all that, and that was just good. It's heavy music, but it's nothing the likes of Conflict or whatever. So that pinned me to the wall. I found my identity, and it was absolutely sublime. It was a brilliant thing to stumble across this subculture of people who felt the exact same as I did. I knew no one who was even thinking the way I was thinking. No matter felt as deeply as I did about this. So to come across this was the most beautiful thing at that age. It was just, yes, I can't believe there's other people out there like this that are so into it. They're making record. Their whole identity is around this. This is what I've been looking for.
It sounds like that sort of awakening, if you like, and that those shifts had a political and a moral angle, as well as probably an epistemological angle about, religion and all at once.
Yes, yeah, and it was highly emotional as well. It was everything wrapped up in once. It was suddenly being presented with an adult way of looking at the world, if you like. I mean, it was highly. There was lots of problems. There wasn't a perfect formulation, but it was an energy boost and an intellectual boost that I'd been starved of because I didn't even know it existed. And here it was suddenly opening up this prize as far as I was concerned. It was brilliant.
And my sense of it, because I've had some guests who've talked about the influence of punk in their intellectual and moral development too. It's been a fascinating theme that's come through like 5 or 6 different interviews, is that within that space, on the epistemology front, there's not much appetite for the spiritual or the supernatural or religion, I guess in part because it's very anti-authoritarian. But how would you describe, how people thought about reality broadly in that space? Was there space for spirituality or the transcendent or something else? Or was it much more a grounded, naturalistic, this is the real world and here's the political reality of it and we must engage directly? How did the epistemological side of that feel?
Okay, it was very much, it was a movement that was full of contradictions and naivety and irony and so on. It straddled both camps to an extent. The presentation was of a very stark black and white version of the world. Beneath the harshness and cynicism of a lot of the lyrics, I think they were deeply disappointed at the world they found around them because they expected so much better from people. And this was how it was coming out. It was just a profound anger at how better things could be and how things are now, as in how they were then and now, perhaps. Their uncompromising nature was the sort of attraction for me. Looking back, it was too uncompromising. It lacked nuance. For a 14-year-old looking for identity, it was perfect, absolutely perfect. I didn't want color. I wanted black and white. Sheer, they're right, or I'm right, they're wrong, and this is why. And as far as animal rights is concerned, that is still how I feel. But this was the first time that people plugged into my anger about what was happening to animals that was just in my head. I don't know how I got in there exactly. And it plugged in and said, we know exactly what you're thinking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And so there was the community to it as well. Like you said, just to be surrounded by people who felt and thought the same way. But to close out on the religion and epistemology front, it sounds like you're probably not a reverent Catholic anymore. Has your journey shifted? Because for me, when I moved away from a religious worldview, I became essentially pretty much an atheist, or at least extreme agnostic, and have been adopted a fairly straight down the line naturalistic way of thinking. You know, I'll use evidence and reason as best I can to try and understand stuff. That includes, you know, recognizing there's loads we don't know. There might be things we could never know, and there might be some really weird stuff out there. But, you know, I'm going to hold back my credences and my beliefs until there's some decent evidence there and it's well corroborated as best I can, right? So that's a fairly boring, straightforward path. Some of my guests have left for an established religion, but have found a path which has still left some space for the spiritual, the transcendent, you know, other senses beyond the natural world. Have you explored any of that stuff at all? Or are you, like me, a sort of straight down the line, you know, naturalistic understanding of the world person?
I am basically an atheist, but like most Christians, I sometimes have my doubts. And I did have a while when I was in our college, when I experimented a lot with psychedelics, magic mushrooms, and a plant called Salvia divinorum. I don't know if you've ever heard of that one. It's a really niche one of itself, and that impressed me quite a bit. And the takeaway from that era of my life was that there's lots of things out there that I don't know, we don't know about, and not sure entirely. I'm very, if I get lost in the woods, things happen in my head. You know, there's a real peace that comes around nature. I don't think that's just. I'm not a hard-headed materialist. No, I think there's something there. I don't know what. It isn't the Christian thing. It isn't the religious thing. But there's something nebulous there that when you're out in the woods on your own, or under certain moods, or maybe psychedelics. Ayahuasca is meant to be similar, like with the Salvia divinorum. There's something out. There's things go on around the world that I can't explain, and that rationality can't explain, and that excites me. I don't know what it is. I don't think I ever will know what it is. I don't think there's life after death, unfortunately, because I really enjoy life, and death does scare me. So I would like to think there's something else out there. It certainly isn't the model I was taught as I was growing up. It certainly isn't that. Or if it is, I really hope it isn't anything like that, because it's a horrible vision. But there is stuff out there that goes beyond the mere material. I don't know. I do know when I die, and if I get buried, and I'll be broken down into nutrients and get absorbed by, say, whatever's around me, like a tree, and then am I sort of that tree now? I don't know. But it's a really nice thought to be a tree.
Thank you.
And they live for hundreds of years if they're in the right place.
And I think those experiences, whether it's walking in the woods or meditation or even psychedelics, seem to, you know, some people, that opens their mind up to, you know, is reality actually different? For others, including me, I tend to think it's more a reflection of the weirdness and the wondrousness of our brains rather than necessarily the nature of reality itself. But I think that regardless, that sense of doubt and open-mindedness, I think is an important part of a naturalistic worldview as well. If you're too dogmatically physical reality is all there is, then you've closed your mind to quite a lot of modern science already. So yeah. I mean, it's nothing that I can do much with. It's just sort of thoughts in the back of my mind at certain times when I'm thinking about this. I wouldn't turn it into anything formal or institutionalize it. I think that's where things can go wrong. But yeah, certainly having those experiences on mushrooms and salve is. It sort of throws into question, and as you say, I'm not sure if that's the power of the mind or the power of the universe. You know, it's hard to know, but you know, I'll be sort of agnostic about that. I think, you know, and just say I just don't know really. Makes sense. Well, let's come on to the second big philosophical question, the one about what matters, but we should probably just blend it together with who matters too, because it's obvious from what you've said already that this was part of the theme of your thinking, and it feels like it was one of the motivations that was one of the cracks in the early religious worldview too, because some of my guests, it's a more technical evidence and reason thing. You know, they read the Bible or the Quran or whatever it is, and they go, well, the facts just don't stack up. It doesn't seem like it's true to me. With other people, it's more of a moral thing where they're as you said, the idea of dominion over non-human animals, or whether it's sexism or homophobia or casteism or some other sort of behavior pattern that's being suggested, or even, burning in hell for eternity. And people go, hold on, this doesn't sound like good ethics to me. So there's a moral drift away. But I'm interested in that side of your story, both on that, the foundations of ethics, good and bad and right and wrong, and how have you thought about those over time, but also the who matters question about who gets to be included and who should we include in our moral consideration. And again, you can sort of go back to the, Judge Dredd, Pat Mills days and take us through the Anarcho-punk story as well, and just help us understand what was the basics of your ethical thinking and how's that changed over time, and where are you now?
I would say the sort of basis of my ethical thinking hasn't changed that much since I was very young. I've had a quite visceral reaction to particularly animal cruelty. I mean, violence against any being is awful, but nothing stirs me up like seeing any animal being abused. It's a real painful sight and idea in my head. So,
and where do you think that came from? Did you have early experiences with animals or companion animals in the home?
No, I don't think so. No, we had a pet when I was young that my dad sort of gave away to a farmer. I'm not sure where we ended up. No, I wasn't particularly. No, I'm not a real animal person. I don't stop at every cat I see on the street for 20 minutes stroking them. I do like animals. I do like being around them. To me, they're the same as people. Really, I like some, I don't like others, and some like me, and some don't. It's a person. They're full of personality, and I'm not really sure where it came from. The only tangible things I can say, sort of lay it on for the obvious reasons of the stories that I was reading is the comics, and that was the sort of start. But why I read that into it, or why I had that as the takeaway, I really don't know. I wasn't brought up in a society or in a family that were everyone at me. We all at me. The idea of animals having even names, having pet names, to my dad was just the stupidest idea ever. And he was raised in a farm. All animals were there to be worked or eaten or milked. And if a farm dog had his day and was no longer a useful farm dog, he was just simply shot and thrown into a bin at the back. There was so no, I didn't get it from anyone around me. It was just there, and I was looking for something to plug that into, some sort of cultural place to go, an ideological place to go to sort of to see that reflected. And in Ireland, there was nothing like that whatsoever. There was a barely visible vegetarian society. There was a sort of a league against cruel sports sort of group. Hunting was rife. Coursing, enclosed coursing was really popular, where a hare is chased around an enclosed field and just mauled by greyhounds. It was a very highly species, this still is, country. How I popped that, I have no idea. I really don't. But there was a couple of dozen other like me around the same time that I met in Cork City, all anarcho-punks. And we formed punk bands and our own animal rights group and went from there. So there was a tiny, tiny minority of people who were really interested in this. I don't think any one of us knew where it came from, because it didn't come from any of our parents. It was just there. We were just the 1 in 10,000 who come out thinking like this. And we happened to meet up because there was a subculture called Anarcho-punk that really emphasized this. Coincidentally, we were around at the same time and bumped into each other because it's a small place, and just became really firm friends. I mean, comrades, friends, trauma bonding, you name it. It's all, they're very strong, loyal bonds there. And it went on from there. I moved to the UK, which has a much more burgeoning scene. I got straight involved in the hunt slaps there. So yeah, it was always there, is the only answer I can give. And where it came from, no idea. But it will never go away. It will never. I mean, it's sometimes it's a painful thing to carry around, because when you get exposed to footage of stuff that's happening, or you hear about something awful that's happening piled on top of the other awful stuff, I just can't think about it anymore. Really, I can't. I would go insane. The only thing I can do about it is to try and lessen the amount of violence out there. It's the only way I can handle that whole issue. If I was to be passive around this, I think I'd crack up. I just couldn't sit back and do nothing. It stirs up so much in me that it would do me psychological damage to actually not do anything about this, I think,
Yeah, it cuts that deep. And it may seem weird to dig into this, but there's clearly a response to and a rejection of that violence and a horror of that violence done to others. Is that more because you feel a compassion for the suffering of the victim, or is it because you feel an outrage at the perpetrator? Is it because you feel the victim is being harmed, or is it because they're being constrained? And I guess I'm trying to get it at, are there different pieces of that focused ultimately more on, liberation and autonomy and freedom, or suffering and harm, or is it the wrong that's being done by the moral agents, or is it all just, all together?
The mush, big soup of that. I would say it's a soup, but let me see. I would say it's the main thing is sort of an empathy, sort of suffering with other people's suffering, and because it's quite tangible, it means I'm feeling that pain too. So it's almost as if it's been done to me, sort of thing. Even though I don't want to claim sort of victimhood or like that, but it's sort of it's that offensive, And the only remedy is to then be proactive about that. Violence is contextual. And aggression is contextual, and not all aggression and violence is wrong. And depending why you're doing it and who you're doing it to makes not all the difference, but a hell of a lot of difference, and enough of a difference to make it to be acceptable at times. And when you're involved in animal rights, you will come across a lot of people who have very little tolerance for anything, for your stand, taking action about it. The reaction has been extreme. I worked for 20 years in psychiatric hospitals and in learning disabilities institutions with some severely unwell people, and that doesn't come close to the violence I saw as a hunt saboteur, particularly in Ireland. I mean, the manic, almost the animalistic feral aggression that you see, this sort of the hatred in the faces of people coming towards you, it's terrifying, it's illuminating, and you're in a situation that you front up or you go home and stay home, because it'll be overwhelming otherwise, and you won't do the animals any good by ending up in A&E. So I would say violence it isn't always to be not used. There's a time and a place. It's an awful tool. And violence breeds violence, and so on. In short-term situations, it can be very effective.
Yeah. So it feels like the real moral core ultimately is an empathic connection with the suffering of others, but there is a sort of broader, like you say, a soup of other stuff that fills that out. And there's also a sense that taking a moral stance doesn't imply an unconditional pacifism. And I've said a similar thing when I'm describing sentientism, because people say, well, what do you mean by compassion for all sentient beings or moral consideration for all sentient beings? And it isn't, some people might take that in a certain direction that, precludes all violence, but I don't think that's embedded in it, because quite often you can act with force or violence in a justified way out of compassion for the potential victims of another, for example. So I think there are, just as within human ethics and human rights, there are situations where you are justified in breaching the rights of another human, and the same can be true in a sentientist context as well. And like you say, you've got to be extremely careful with that because of the issues with violence and the problems that can flow from it. But it can be justified, and it might be interesting to, as we sort of round out this who matters question, because it's clear that this idea about non-human animals was important to you from quite early on, but that can manifest itself in a bunch of different ways. There's the story of recognizing the implications for our consumption choices, for example, and a transition to veganism. There's the choice to get involved in various types of activism and how those pieces of activism work. So it'd be interesting to know your story about how you stepped into those worlds and how you got involved in them. And it links interestingly with, I guess the final question is how to make a better future, but part of how to make that better future is understanding history. And it feels like as you moved into those spaces, there wasn't really any history that you were stepping into. It felt like a sort of vacuum where it's just you and your mates and, a small group of people coming up with this radically new way of doing things. But in your book, you've discovered there's a much richer history, particularly in Ireland, of people looking at this issue in different ways. I don't know how you want to get into that space of your own personal journey into getting serious about animal ethics and what that felt like and what the implications were and how you carried it through, but also how your activism fits into that broader historical context?
So it was when I moved to the UK. Initially, I was there for a couple of summers when I was 17 and 18, and I went along to a bunch of gigs and met a lot of people, and they were banging on about the Hunsab movement, and that was a huge thing at the time. There was loads of people involved in it. It was getting lots of media attention. Lots of incidents were happening, and they were making the news. It was a real issue, Ian. This is the late 1980s. But it wasn't until I moved to the UK proper when I travelled over there to become a nurse, a psychiatric nurse at the age of 24. And I was living in north of London in Hertfordshire in Watford. And there was a nearby group of saboteurs. Again, all punks. They were in punk bands. They were the exact same as the bunch of friends I had left in Cork, but they were a bit more organised. They had vehicles. They were a little bit older, and they had a history of doing this stuff for about 4 or 5 years against this specific cunt, the Vale of Aylesbury, who have since disbanded. So I got straight in. I just couldn't wait to get stuck in. It was the first thing I did was to hook up with the contact I had and go out straight away sabbing. And I was with a group of people who were really experienced. The hunt that they were sabbing had been receiving attention from saboteurs since the early 1970s. So they had gone through their spasms of violent reaction and all the rest of it, and had by this time, so you're talking sort of 20 plus years of continuous sabotage. So a sort of rough sort of dynamic had been reached where they wouldn't attack us because they'd know that we'd come down the next week with all our mates and sort of attack them back. And we wouldn't stop sabbing. The best thing that they could do was try to ignore us and leave us alone. And we'll carry on sabbing peacefully in our small little group where we won't have to be concerned about violence. I'd been involved in a group of saboteurs over in Galway the previous summer, and we had this shit kicked out of us. I mean, if they could have hung us from the lampposts, they would have. If they had rope, they would have done it. We had the shit kicked out of us. So I was sort of expecting the same thing in the UK, but I was pleasantly surprised to see that it wasn't always like that, and that you could go out tactically sabbing with 3 or 4 other people and not get attacked, and people just try and ignore you, but you're actually doing a really effective job because you know how to sabotage and all that. So yeah, it was sort of it was a scene within a scene, really. It was mainly populated by anarcho-punks, so we used to hang around together, we used to party together afterwards, we used to go to gigs together. It was a real lifestyle for years and years and years. And then when the anti-globalization stuff started around the 2000s, I got heavily involved in that. Went over to Genoa and Prague and Dublin. There was events in London. Got involved with the Wombles there, where we were trying to form a defensive line between riot police and protesters by wearing sort of padded gear and carrying shields that would protect us from them. And it was imported from the Basta movement over in Italy. So heavily involved in the anarchist direct action scene in London around the turn of the 21st century. Almost got imprisoned for various things, and then decided to step back from that a bit and wrote for Snooze down in Brighton for about 5 or 6 years, which was a weekly eco-anarchist sort of publication. And I lived in Brighton for many years. So I'm not sure if that's answered your question, but that's been the sort of the history of my activism. It's been inspired by classical anarchism from the time of Kropotkin and Bakunin and people like that, but I was interested in it because of the direct action emphasis of anarchism, and it appreciated direct action as a tactic. It appreciated animal rights as a noble goal. It was the only part of the radical left that were genuinely interested in animal rights, I would say. The anarchist left, Labour left, couldn't give a shit about it. I mean, if you want to see a socialist radical turn into a conservative reactionary, just mention animal rights a lot of the times, because they have a real reaction to it. I think it's taken attention away from the class war and all this sort of stuff. But we were really into it. There was a time there when green anarchism, class war, animal rights were all part of the subculture. There was Reclaim the Streets was happening. There was a lot of sort of stuff like that. There was a real vibe then. It got sort of crushed and had its time and various things. Nowadays, that space is being dominated by the far right, I would say, and it's them that are sucking up all the media oxygen, banging on about immigration and all the rest of it. That place used to be taken by the sort of eco-anarchist left, the sort of subcultural thing that was boiling to the surface every so often. Now it's dominated by the far right and the alt-right, I would say, unfortunately. So yeah, and a little bit involvement with anti-fascist action as well, way back. So direct action, as I say, has always been a very important tool. I think this could lead on to how to make a better future. I think the way to make a better future, it's a combination of tactics, but I think direct action is a vital part of that. So Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, and so on. These are the modern day groups that have taken over from groups like the Hunt Saboteurs to extent, and the Animal Liberation Front and stuff. You know?
Yeah. And how have you come to think about the role of direct action? Because there's so many different ways people can think about it. Some people will think of it as something that is just viscerally important for an individual to get involved in because it just sort of feels good to be doing something with an impact I can see, sometimes out of a desperation a cause and sometimes just out of a personal commitment to get involved. So it's very much an individual thing about plugging in and just doing something. Others have a broader sort of effectiveness view about its role in shifting the Overton window or the zeitgeist or PR or impact on the press or how public things. How have you come to think about the role of direct action, either philosophically or in terms of its effectiveness in actually making real change for victims?
I think on the first point of it being a sort of catharsis for individuals to get things off their chest, that is true of, I would say, most forms of direct action. That's an element of most forms of direct action. It's a very healthy thing to do. To keep it all pent up inside can be disastrous for the individual. It doesn't justify direct action in and of itself necessarily, but it is important to recognize the cathartic nature of direct action and the psychological health that I think naturally flows from that. When direct action is done collectively in conjunction with other forms of action, and in the animal rights history, I would point to campaigns like the anti-fur campaign during the 80s and 90s, where you had a coalition of groups like Lynx and Greenpeace and the Sea Shepherd attacking it from one side with information and getting on TV and taking video footage of seals being clubbed and so on. And then on the other side, on the other end of that spectrum, you the ALF and so on, burning down department stores that had fur coats on sale in them. So between the two fronts, the fur industry was decimated in about 5 or 6 years. So when forms of direct action are used in conjunction with forms of above ground, a more legalistic nature, and when they're done wisely, a direct action should be direct, by which I mean, I think some of the scattergun approach of Just Stop Oil can be counterproductive, perhaps. I don't criticize them for what they're doing at all, but I think rather than blocking a motorway, it might be better to say block the entrance to a dairy processing plant. Hit the real enemy directly rather than stopping everyone just going about their daily business. I can see a point in that. I can see what they're trying to do. But I'm not sure if it's a bit too much for people to listen to the message as well then when everything stopped from going somewhere. I think the stuff like the animal rights and stuff and Animal Rebellion were doing very direct action where they were taking over slaughterhouses and Smithfield's meat market and so on. And that's getting to the core of the problem then, you know? So the animal rights movement has always used direct action because if they didn't, nothing would be getting done about the issue whatsoever, because this will never come from government. They are not interested in this, unfortunately. And not much will come from the general public either. They're interested in maybe banning fox hunting or stag hunting, but they're not interested in say, the same concerns about fishing, for instance. So the general public and the government can't be relied upon to be a serious force for animals on this planet. It can only come, unfortunately, at the moment. I mean, this should change, and this hopefully will change, and governments will take the initiative and take things on board in time. But from its inception in the 1960s, I would say, the militant animal rights movement has been needed to punch its way through people's imagination and the cozy social consensus and to demand attention, because there was no other way it was going to it had to demand it, and it had to do it loudly and aggressively, and it did so, to break through.
And I guess part of the reason why that was needed, but because of the inertia of, I guess, mainstream public opinion, is because of one of the other things you mentioned, that there's nowhere on the political spectrum that was willing to pick this up as even a valid issue. And I've had some fascinating conversations in recent months with people like Troy Vertese and Emmy Leese and John Sambo Matsu, all from the political left and some Marxists who've all sort of been deeply frustrated by the fact that parts of the political spectrum who are richly invested in the wrongness of oppression and exploitation and, feeling a rich solidarity, even those who are different from us and we don't know, at the core of their ethical thinking, those political movements can still be brutally anthropocentric. And I don't know if you've got a sense as to what, why at least the left of center politically haven't been able to pick that up.
Yeah, it's bizarre. If you look at the extreme right, you get a similarly convoluted history. It's much more patchy than on the left, but a weird way of looking at animals. I'm not sure, and it is infuriating because you're talking to. I've often found myself talking to Marxist communists. Corey Lee Wren would be another person who's an academic, who's a feminist Marxist and also a vegan. So there is a growing, there is a change here happening. But yes,
I think there is. There's more voices out there. Absolutely. Yeah.
There is. Yeah. Especially on the radical left. And they are recognizing that the most oppressed animal in a factory farm isn't the underpaid worker. It's the chicken in the cage. They're both being exploited, but one's being exploited a lot more ruthlessly than the other one. For Marxists to not see that, considering their whole agenda, the whole project is one of liberation, is really odd, especially that Marx himself used the term species being as the culmination and the reason behind the entire project. And species being is the freedom of all species to live their life as nature intended their species to live their life. So chickens can stretch their wings and fly. Humans can move around the world and be autonomous labor agents and in a free society and so on. And it was all about, he used that term. It wasn't just human being or human welfare. It was species being. It was each species coming into its own being in full. And this was the reason behind the entire Communist Manifesto, was to realize that as a goal. Yet at the same time, they were Marx and Engels were deeply cynical about the growing vegetarian movement in places like Manchester and London at that time in the late 18th century. They poured scorn in it, thought it was and there was a certain sort of mild socialist left, the Fabian Society types, who were often vegetarians as well. And Engels particularly poured scorn on these people. They were bourgeois sentimentalists who had no interest in the class war, all this sort of stuff. He had no time for this whatsoever. And so the only explanation I can have for this is that so-called communist liberators are also marinated in a society that is so speciesist, that speciesism is a root metaphor that goes deeper probably than sexism, right? Deeper than that. Going right back through history, the separation of humans from all the other animals probably happened maybe tens of thousands of years ago. I mean, it's hard to put a date on it, but certainly it predates the agricultural revolution, this idea of supremacy, that we're better than them, that we're above them. And I can understand in some ways how that came along, the power of language and cultural learning and all this sort of stuff. They are pretty impressive, and architecture, and we have been a pretty impressive species. But the biggest poison in our brain is this idea of what Christians call dominion, but it's longer than that. It's been around for a lot longer than Christianity has, So it's going to be like extracting a tooth with no pain relief. It's in there that deep into the human mind body, And
it really is. And many thinkers have done fascinating work about talking about how that separation and that supremacy concept have then rippled through and been one of the prime causes of many of the intrahuman discrimination.
Yes, class.
You talked about so as well. Yeah. Another book recommendation for you, talking about how Marx and Engels and others were thinking that through. Have you come across Marx for Cats yet? So I've interviewed Lee-Claire Leberge, who's an author and a professor, written a book called Marx for Cats, using the cat as a sort of lens onto the history of Marxist thinking and animals. It's a brilliant read, and look out for the interview coming up. So put that on your list.
Oh, brilliant! Oh, yeah. Looking forward to that, because I think the radical left have really missed a beat there. There was something that was naturally in their camp, and they rejected it. It must be said, they rejected it, and they didn't want anything to do with it. And they thought it was just a waste of time. Instead of latching on to a new front in the struggle against oppression, they were like, no way, this is a waste of time for us. So they missed the beat, and much of to their detriment, the radical animal rights movement in the 70s and 80s and 90s in the UK and Ireland outshone the radical left to the power of 10 and then some in terms of actions. So the radical left were all theory and sitting around pubs talking about stuff. They were not really generally doing stuff. And the stuff they were doing was really ineffectual, and direct action was nowhere near the agenda. It wasn't a tactic they were prepared to even consider. Usually, I mean, there are exceptions, and there are people who weren't like that. But on the whole, that wasn't a place. We naturally thought, oh, the radical left are going to be really interested in all our ideas that we'd be getting from Crass Records about animals and all that. So we'll go talk to these guys, SWP and all that. And they were like, get the hell out of here. This is not for us. It's middle class wankery, you know. Awful.
Yeah. So one of the fascinating things, and maybe a hopeful thing, given those missteps you talked about, and how difficult the struggle is now, how countercultural it feels even today, is that sometimes it feels like quite a new movement. You know, it feels like animal rights and animal advocacy were things that were invented in recent decades, and we just got to, you know, work on it and push it forward. But the history is ancient and deep rooted, and you can go back, you know, certainly all the way through ideas like ahimsa that runs through the Dharmic religions, which is about, you know, non-violence and doing no harm, not just to other humans, but to any being that can be harmed, which is a sentient being. And you could go back more ancient than that. There have always been people who cared about non-human animals. In almost every human culture, and religious and not, around the world, at every period, there were people, you know, thinking roughly along these lines. And that's certainly true in more recent history as well. But quite a lot of that history does get lost or forgotten. And I don't know if you wanted to tell us a bit of the story about the humanity trigger in the book you've written, just to use that as an example of how some of these themes have been around for longer than we think, and how they still ripple through today.
Yeah, the inspiration for the book, I mean, initially it started off, I was about 2021, I was invited onto an Irish podcast called Policed, which looked at the experiences that Irish people had from various stratas of society in dealing with the Irish police. So you had people from the travelling community, you had Dunn Stores strikers during the 70s talking about how they were policed and how they felt about it and so on. So I was invited on to speak about my experiences dealing with the police as a hunt saboteur in the west of Ireland around 1994 and 1995, when there was the violent incident that I referred to earlier, and my experiences there. So I was doing a bit of research before I went on the podcast to see, just to follow up, I had left the country in about a year after the attack and got heavily involved in the UK scene and dropped out of the Irish scene, obviously, and didn't pick up on what had been happening there since I'd emigrated. So I ended up joining the Irish Newspaper Archive, which is a website that you pay a monthly fee and you go onto their search engine. It's every newspaper that was ever printed in Ireland, north side of the border, ever since newspapers were. So the very first one is the Belfast Telegraph, which is in 1753. And then every issue of that newspaper and every other newspaper that ever came and went or came and still there is there. So it's a massive search engine of everything that was reported in the media since the media began in Ireland. So this is just a treasure trove. So I went into the search engine and put in some keywords like hunt sabotage, expecting maybe 3 or 4 references to sort of pop up, mainly to do with the attack that I was involved in up in Galway, because as far as I was concerned, that was the only thing that had ever happened really. Not the only thing, but certainly the most dramatic thing at the time. But no, loads of stuff came up, like hundreds of articles across many years, some including stuff I'd been involved in, but stuff I'd never heard of as well. And then I put in some more terms like Animal Liberation Front, Animal Liberation, Animal Rights, full list of stuff. And there was thousands of articles and letters to the editor and opinions, editorials, exposés, small little snippets to reports of a smashed window of a butcher shop in County Leitrim, everything. So everything that was ever mentioned to do with animal rights in all these newspapers, I had a narrative in front of me. I had a story going back since the 1960s, as far as the direct action scene was concerned, right up to the present day, of every attack, every reported incident, every outrage letter from a farmer to the local newspaper that was to do with this issue was there in front of me. So I got, this has to be, the information's there, but it's spread across hundreds of newspapers. That as I was growing up, this was a history of what was happening when I was growing up. But because I lived in one particular place, if I didn't have access to the local parochial paper from a few counties away, that was the only paper reporting on a specific incident, that I was now looking at on the search engine. It was my first time hearing about this, even though it had been in the media, but it wasn't media that I had access to. The internet is a powerful tool. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, but the access to information, obviously, that you can have with this, it's so easy to do research. So I just plunged into it, and for about 2 years, I was investigating every incident of direct action for animals, whether it was not, whether it was legal or not, violent or not, whether I agreed with it or not. If it was done legitimately in the name of animal rights, and it was on the spikier end of the scale or the direct action end of the scale, I wanted to know about it, and I put it into this book and made a history out of it. And then I discovered that it was sort of going back in 1822. There was a guy called Richard Morton who was the first person to pass a state legislation detecting it was the Cruelty to Cattle Act, and then he set up the RSPCA to enforce that act. Then he set up the world's first police force to populate the RSPCA, to go out onto the streets and to arrest people and bring them to court. So the world's first police force was the RSPCA. It wasn't a human police force. It wasn't the Metropolitan Police, and they came along about 5 years later and based their system on the RSPCA, their uniforms and their rank structure and all that on the. So the animals had a police force before humans did, albeit very small and underfunded and all the rest of it, but it was there. So I was finding all this stuff out, and it was this is amazing. I'd been involved in this movement for years and had never heard of any of this because it had never been collected by someone and just put in between two covers. And there's loads of personalities, like the guy Jack McClellan, this Northern Irish guy who was he was a mixed martial artist of his day and a champion swimmer. He'd swim these stretch of treacherous Irish waters, in front of massive crowds, and was winning all sorts of awards. He was a vegan, had his own pain stores around Ireland. Again, I had never heard of this guy, ever. There should be statues around the country for him because he broke so many records. He was a boxer, a footballer, all these, a swimmer and all that, and also a vegan, a hardcore vegan. And
today he'd be all over Instagram, but...
He would, wouldn't he? He'd have his own podcast, wouldn't he? And it just drops out of history. The recording of history has changed so much, and now we have I can sit in a room and have all the world in this computer, and I can discover what I want to discover. And I just got really into it. I got really absorbed by this history that even I didn't know about it. And if I didn't know about it, hardly anyone else is going to know about it because I'm really into this. So it was really exciting, interesting, exciting story. For instance, the links between the early IRA, the pre-1916 IRA, and the rising vegetarian movement in Dublin was really close. And the Indian revolutionaries who inspired Gandhi, who were studying over in Dublin because it was part of the British Empire at the time, were all vegetarian, and they used to all meet in this one vegetarian cafe in Dublin, the only one of its kind. So you had Indian student revolutionaries, IRA revolutionaries, and vegetarian revolutionaries all meeting in this one room. And of course, they discussed revolution and hid arms there. And the history is golden, and it hasn't been recorded properly. And so I figured if no one else is going to do it, then I will. And it was a project I immensely enjoyed. I mean, to discover this history of like-minded folk that stretched right back from my native country was a real joy, because it's places like England and America are more what comes to people's minds when they think of animal rights. It's where the action has been more, and things of England obviously is the sort of birthplace of a lot of this stuff, But I'd never known Ireland had played such a prominent role, and I was very pleased to discover it all and write it all down. And then I found these book publishers who were as keen as I was about the whole thing, Earth Island. And it's been a joy, really. It's been a dream come true, really. I didn't think it would actually become a book ever, but there you go.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's a fascinating read, a fascinating story. And I think this is one of the themes that comes up, I guess, in the animal movement broadly, is this sense of, forgotten history. And one of my other previous guests, Kim Stallwood, has really delved into that deeply with his own archives and his research, and a lot of it's been donated to libraries now for sort of formal archival and so on. But there's so much richness in those histories, and as you said, it's almost just like an emotional boost that we're not crazy, because people have thought about this issue for a lot longer than we might have thought. But there's lessons in there too, I guess. And maybe to draw it back to this, how do we make a better future position? You've had quite a fascinating experience in different movements and different forms of activism, and through your work writing the book too. What's your big picture view of how to improve the future now? Whether that involves, a modern view on direct action, or as your anarchism has shifted to anarchish.
Anarchism. Yeah.
Anarchish. What's your big picture view of how do we try and make a better future? And that can be, intrahuman issues as well as the non-human animal issue too. But where's your head at now?
Right. So what definitely needs to happen is that there needs to be a paradigm shift in terms of how the human species, generally how individuals see the world and are placed in the world. That has to happen. We have to be a lot more realistic about that. We're part of the world and not part from it. And we certainly aren't at the tops of any chains. This idea that we're an apex predator and top of the chain is just the most ridiculous idea I've ever heard of. And the only chain that these people are on top of is if there's an idiot chain, then they're definitely on top of that. But that is it. We have to get off this. It is a human supremacist mindset, essentially, and it's as poisonous and as ugly as white supremacism and Nazism, and is much more detrimental because it's going to take us all to hell, really, unless it stops. So we do have a chance to save our environment, which I think is the number one priority. I'm no longer a specificist. That's why I'm no longer, I would say I'm an anarchist. I'm anarchish. I think any political system going forward is going to be an amalgamation of different types of systems. There'll be a little bit of communism. There'll be a little bit of anarchism. There'll be a big ecoism, as a green environmentalism. There might even be a little bit of capitalism. I don't know enough about financial ins and outs to say for certain that you can do away with something like capitalism. There seems to be a human drive in a certain amount of the population's brain that is really attracted to something like capitalism. So I'm not sure if you can ever just ban it or get rid of it. I think you might have to accommodate it. When I was working at the psychiatric hospitals, I took up a mixed martial art called Jeet Kune Do, which is the very first martial art, which was perfected by Bruce Lee. And his philosophy was no system is the system, no order is order. And the idea was that you would look at all the systems that exist currently, take the best bits out of each one that are most relevant to you now, and use them. And don't get caught up in purity or only one system is right and everything else must be ignored. And that's how systems work and all that. So it was an amalgamation of different systems, and it was the precursor to MMA today. And it's what MMA is, the philosophy of MMA is based on. And I think politics could do with a bit of that sort of thinking, where you look at what works around the world in terms of isms and practicalities and try and amalgamate that into an approach. So the best of all the different isms come together into not even one ism. It isn't an ism. It's just a recognition that these are the best ways. These are the best way of doing certain things at certain points in time. So committing myself or a country to an ideology, I don't think is healthy or realistic. I don't think any country is strictly one thing or the other. America is strictly only capitalist. There are strong socialist bents, even in the government there, in terms of the welfare system and all that. In Chinese communism, there's a huge amount of capitalism there. I don't think any one ism can survive isolated and on its own. So I think if we can recognize what works best and is healthiest and is most sustainable throughout the world and use those and not be too worried about ideologies as such. Other than that, including non-human sentient beings, the way we would include humans, I think, is a priority. You get down to a certain point. I think Peter Singer said somewhere in between crabs and some sort of shellfish limpets lies the sort of area where sentience can be said to drop off. Things become things, I suppose. But even those things are highly valuable for their own sake, irrespective of sentience. It's like, I live in my house, the walls aren't living, breathing things, but if someone was to come along and punch holes in the walls, I would take exception to that for all sorts of reasons. Similarly to, in terms of stuff like trees and mushrooms and all sorts, it's exciting. And insects, the more and more science comes out, the more we find out about the natural, where we realize how sentient it all is. I think there's a precautionary principle to come into play as well, where we can assume things are sentient unless we're really sure they're not. And even if they're not, that doesn't mean that we can destroy them or just use them like as we will. You know, everything's contextual. It's okay to throw a stone into a river, but it's not okay to throw a cat into a river. You know, so you just sort of apply a bit of wisdom to that. You know, but yeah, we're far too wrapped up in humanity only like America first, humanity first sort of stuff. It's going to be our comeuppance in the end.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a mindset shift in terms of humanity's position and a broad understanding of what other things, beings should matter, as well as a sort of, mix of the best of different parts of ideologies rather than getting trapped by one as a dogmatic stance. Yeah, thank you. And the sentience question is interesting because one of the irritating things about sentientism as a worldview is it doesn't tell us which beings are sentient. It just says use evidence and reason to try and work it out. And that means that picture may shift over time. But I completely agree. There seems to be a mindset, which I think comes out of the human supremacy thing, which is we will assume others are not sentient until there's proof that they're sentient. And that proof often requires us to do horrific experiments on them to find out if they feel the pain as a result. It's like, why do they have to earn the right? And I like your approach of having a much broader assumption about sentience. And if someone really wants to demonstrate that, a bivalve absolutely isn't, or a sea sponge isn't, well, fine. If you really want to explore that, that's great. But why not do it that way around rather than, you have to prove yourself before you earn even basic moral consideration. It seems bizarre.
Like an inquisition, like a test you have to pass to get into the gang sort of thing. But even people like Descartes back in the day, he explained away the screams of dogs as he was cutting them open on the vivisection table as automatic reactions, like a door might make a squeak or something like this. So we're able to separate ourselves from the rest of nature, even when it's screaming in pain in front of us, nailed to a table. We're still able to come up with excuses as to how this shouldn't matter. And this dog isn't actually in pain, even despite all the evidence. So humanity has an amazing ability to insist on its own supremacy. And it's the height of snobbery.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. The amount of human mental capacity that is dedicated to putting ourselves at the top of the hierarchy and then post-justifying that is absolutely amazing. So I guess a final question before I let you go. You started out in Ireland and now you're in New Zealand, and people who don't know much about either might think there's a sort of rich commonality between the two. Beautiful countries, agriculture is quite a rich part of their heritage. How does the dynamic feel around the animal issue in New Zealand through your role on the board of the Vegan Society, and what would you tell outsiders about how the dynamic feels locally there?
I would say it's actually very similar to Ireland in terms of the number of people who are vegan, vegetarian. It's sort of hovering about 5% vegan, 8% vegetarian, very similar to Ireland. Hunting is different here. It's more democratic. It's right. The issue here is that every mammal on these two islands, apart from the long-tailed bat and the short-tailed bat, is not natural to here, right? None of the spiders or rats, anything that moves on the ground besides these two species of bat that you rarely ever see. And there's a few species of bird, the kiwi and a few ones there. So everything else is not meant to be here. It's an invasive species. So you have this culture where schools, primary schools, will organize cat hunting days out in the bush, and it'll be on the news as hey, isn't this quirky and funny? There's a school down in Southland there, and they're having their annual bash a wildcat to death day. Massive rabbit shooting culls, duck shooting is huge. It'll be on the news of a guy being wheeled out in his wheelchair where they built a special platform for him to blast away at the ducks. And isn't this great that the community has come out and built this little platform for this guy, and they interview him, and no problem with this whatsoever. They'll blast everything out of the sky. And the reason given is that all these are pest species, and they're not endemic to the country. They came over here via humans, all of them almost, on boats and so on. And they've set up shop here. They're a danger to the little flora and fauna that are left, so we need to kill everything. They drop a poison called 1080 out of the skies from helicopters into forests to kill off everything there. All the possums, all the stoats, everything that lives there, to kill it all off in order to bring natural species back. Right, so it's completely different to the UK or Ireland, where all the animals there, almost all of them, have been there for centuries, most of them, except for the mink. So the hunters don't have that excuse to sort of fall back home, it's easy to expose them as being sort of sadistic and predatory themselves and only in it for the fun, which is the case. Here it's different. If you have a go people hunting here, they'll say, "Oh, the ducks we're shooting are eating all the whatever they're eating, and it's going to kill off that area, so we need to kill all of them." They're doing it because they enjoy it. If they didn't enjoy it, they wouldn't be doing it. It's getting up in the morning, going out into cold, wet marsh buckland, sitting for hours. So you have to want to be there. They are doing it because they want to, but they're able to fall back on that excuse every single time, and it's accepted by the public that is just the way things are. There isn't any fox hunting here because there isn't any foxes, but as I say, it is really popular amongst just the general working man sort of thing, and everyone else as well. So,
and those categories are so convenient, aren't they? I mean, as they are in intrahuman ethics, right? If you put someone in a different category that classes them as the other or not natural or different, all of a sudden anything goes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems noble and sort of, it's a worthy pursuit all of a sudden because it's been done for a higher cause almost even. So when it comes to that sort of hunting, it's sort of difficult for people to hear the counter argument, but in terms of veganism, generally speaking, it's the dairy industry here are huge, right? As they are in Ireland, they haven't been tightly regulated for years. It's getting a bit tighter now, but there's still so many loopholes. As a result, about 80% of all the freshwater lakes in this country aren't fit for humans to touch, not a mind ingest. Mainly, almost in every case, I'd say about 80% of the cases, because of nitrate runoff from dairy industry. So the dairy industry have managed to position themselves as the backbone of the economy and the salt of the earth, at the same time destroying massively the ecosystem here. And of course, it isn't just the rivers; it's the methane from the cows and so on. So Fonterra, the dairy and conglomerate that controls our industry here, they are the country's largest polluters by a long shot. They overshoot the oil producers, the second biggest producers, by double. They are a massive infringement on the environment, and they only employ about 10,000 people. So they've managed to position themselves as heroes of society, whilst actually being the most destructive force in this country by a long shot.
It's like they're cultural icons.
They're heroes to people, And if you say anything about them, they're like, "Do you not know where your food comes from? And no farmers, no food." They've even managed to hijack the word farmer. So only people in animal agriculture are considered farmers. Everyone else is a grower.
Yeah.
Right? Bastards. I mean,
it's incredible. Their lobbyists deserve a pay rise. It's amazing marketing.
The PR coup. I mean, it's magnificent PR work. Absolute magnificent. But they're pushing at an open door. Everyone wants to hear this. No one objects to it, apart from the vegans and so on. And the environmentalists and groups.
It's a con where people want to be conned.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. It's disgusting to see. It's so patronizing. And so the farmers here they're alone to themselves almost, they go around in their big boots and their big 4x4. There's an identity there that is completely unjustified.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. Thank you. And how do you feel in terms of prospects for the future for Aotearoa? Because your vegan vegetarian numbers are pretty high. The environmental pressures are growing. Yeah.
It is inspiring to be involved in this small but growing scene. I've always loved my involvement in animal rights. It's really given colour to my life. I'm terrified about the future. I have 2 young kids. A couple of years ago, I remember some podcast mentioning there was some sort of climate anxiety, and they come up with some word to describe specifically this anxiety that adults had about the future, and especially if they had kids and all this, and it was to do with the breakdown of the climate and all the rest of it. And there was some word for it, and I was thinking, this is a bit silly. It's a bit extreme to be. And then quite soon after that, and actually this is not silly at all, the research coming in, this is deeply, deeply personally depressing. And I don't know what the future for my kids is going to be like. I'm terrified of that. And I look around and I wonder where's the modern day anarcho-punk militant reaction to this that we need. And I don't know where it is. And we so need it now. And it can be there. We have the chance now. We're in this bottleneck century, even bottleneck generation. If we can sort things out in the next 20, 30, 20, 40, we've got a chance. But this really requires mass mobilization, mass direct action, mass political action, everything everywhere all at once. I'm hanging out for that to happen. It is quite isolated down here in New Zealand, quite far away from the nearest next country, really, is Australia. That's a 4-hour flight. You do feel isolated. There's a certain sense of safety here globally because of the isolation. I do miss the sort of cold face and the frontline stuff I did back in the day, but maybe I'll be doing that again soon because time is short, clock's running out. The 2 minutes to midnight, the doomsday clock that's wheeled out every so often, and then they shifted forward a bit closer to 12. That should be at about 25 past 12, really. It's gone well past midnight. We're really in the sort of the danger zone, the death zone. When you go up above a certain height in Everest, it's a bit like that, and I do wonder.
And the irony is we've basically got the solutions we need to fix these problems. What the problem is, as you say, mindset and political will. And, maybe we'll do the usual human thing of when the crisis really, really starts to bite us, we'll turn around at the last minute. But we really love the last minute. So
it's if you give them this staying up all night the day before your exams, just cramming it all in, and people do that, and that is the outside hope now. I think at this point where when people's backs are literally against the wall on a personal basis, then we will see the survival reaction kick in. Whether it's too late or not at that point is the sort of question. Whether we've kicked in the feedback systems that make it go out of our control. We are in control of the future still right now, unbelievably. That is slipping out of our fingers. 10, 15 years, it won't be, I would say. Or it'll be enough of it will be gone out of control that the future is looking. In some way, I hate to say this, pretty bleak. This is such a beautiful planet, and to see it all fry up and see the death of birth, it's just awful.
Yeah, I like looking at Venus in the night sky, but I don't want Venus to be here. So.
I don't want to live there. Yeah,
No, exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, getting to hear your story. Is there anything else you wanted to add into the conversation beyond? We've already answered what's real, who matters, and how to make a better world. But
I think that's good. It's quite enough for one evening. It's been really good to talk to you, Jamie. I really like talking about this stuff, and I hope you the best of luck in the future. It's the sort of work that you should keep on doing, because people need to know this history and to need to know the sort of people that you're talking to. They need to be heard.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a tiny audience, but hopefully it is shifting people's mindsets a little bit in a positive direction. So let's see. And what's the best way of people buying your book, following the work you do? And I can include links in the show notes, of course, but where would you point people?
So the book's available direct from the publisher at Earth Island Books in the UK, or around the world from Amazon or Barnes and Noble, or in a lot of independent bookshops around the planet, in the States and over here as well in New Zealand. So online, it's a paperback, ebook, and in bookstores as well.
And it's called The Humanity Trigger, yeah?
So it's The Humanity Trigger, that's right, by Mark Humanity. And I run a website of the same name, thehumanitytrigger.com, which is a poorer written version of the book, essentially, with a few more bits sort of added in. And that is it. I'm on the board of the New Zealand Vegan Society, but that's just sort of down here stuff. So internationally, it's those two places.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you as a guest on Sentientism, and please do stay in touch.
Thank you for sharing your time with me.
Yeah, take care.